Hello. Just want to apologize ahead of time because I think I have a cold, or hopefully not COVID. Anyways, this is Origins of Crime Stories, radio and television in the early of 20th century, and my name is Nick Helms. And this will be a presentation about the types of crime stories in radio and television in the early 20th century. In the early days of radio in the early 20th century, radio went from something that was a tool for business and military purposes to being the main form of entertainment. This was before the dawn of television, and what brought radio into its golden age was the development of broadcast networks. NBC was the first network to come into existence. As the years went by, more networks were formed. In radio's heyday, which was during the 1930s and 1940s, these networks hired writers to create programs of different genres, including crime. I think the most notable one that has been an influence in the world is The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes started in 1930. It was adapted from the stories of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The scriptwriter on the show was Edith Meiser. Richard Gordon played Sherlock Holmes, and Lee Lovell, played Dr. Watson. This went on for 5 seasons, and then it switched to The New Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And I believe it is easy to tell how much Sherlock Holmes has had an influence on crime stories even today. Call the Police was another radio program. This ran from the 1947 to 1949. George Petrie played Bill Grant on the radio program. His character served in World War II. His father was a police officer, and he died during service whenever Bill was overseas, and so he returned home. At what point he went to the FBI Academy, and then after he got done with the FBI Academy, he came home and had found that his city was taken over by criminals, and then he would clean up the city. I do apologize. It was described as stories that were hard-hitting recreation of gruesome crimes, the step-by-step actions of the crimes, and police efforts to apprehend the culprits. So, Call the Police took many influences from actual crimes that were going on during the 40s. This is Dick Tracy. I included many different pictures here to talk a little bit about Dick Tracy. Dick Tracy started, this is actually kind of the opposite of most things on here, because this actually was a comic at first, and then it became a radio program. The radio program was influenced by the comic strip. The radio program started in 1934. It was based on the comic strip Dick Tracy by Chester Gould. The radio rights were arranged by Heman Brown, and it ran also from 1943 to 1948. It went from 1934 until we went into World War II, and then it took a break until 1943 until 1948. And then, as I said, I showed many pictures here. What was significant about Dick Tracy is that it started off as just like a one day thing program, but it ended up keep growing and growing to eventually where it was on Monday through Friday for a whole hour at a time. And so one thing about Dick Tracy was the wristwatch that he had, and I made sure that I included where you could actually get the wristwatch by sending in money to the radio corporation. Dragnet. Now, Dragnet started in 1949. Is the most popular and influential police procedural of all time. Most influential parts of the Dragnet show is definitely the dum dee dum dum. Most people recognize this music intro of the show, even if they've never seen the show, or I mean, listened to the show. I apologize. And many quote. It was also very quotable. Just the facts, man, was one of the many quotes within Dragnet. The creator of Dragnet was also the director. His name was Jack Webb. He also was the star of the show, and he played Detective Sergeant Joe Friday. Now, this stories were actually based on actual police files, and the names were changed to protect the innocent, as the show stated. Now, Dragnet, just a fun fact, means a system of coordinated measures for apprehending criminals or suspects, which is how the show, radio show, got its name. Now, Dragnet was very influential on crime stories as it became a franchise, which spawned many different shows, television shows, films, books, comics, even. We see making the jump. We're now making the jump into looking at some television programs, and what better way to do that but to just stay with Dragnet here, because Dragnet was such a huge deal that it was popular enough to go from radio to television. And it started in 1951 on television, which ran through 1959, and then later came back on television in 1967 and ran to 1970. Once again, even on the television show, starred Jack Webb. It also starred at the beginning Ben Alexander as Officer Smith. Jack Webb was the creator of the show and the director. He directed every episode of Dragnet, and he also wrote a lot of them as well, or several of them. I don't know if I should say a lot. He did write several of them. He didn't actually want to be Friday on the show. However, he wanted Lloyd, an actor named Lloyd Nolan, but the network insisted that he stay on as Joe Friday. So the TV show used the same template as the radio show, but just with visuals. One thing that was what made Dragnet very popular is that Jack Webb insisted that the everything was perfect and sounded correct, which we done on the radio show with the sound effects, and then on the show as well. And he wanted it to be as realistic as possible, which I think maybe made it more influential. These are some Dragnet comics. As we see that as Dragnet went on after it started as a radio show, and I said that it became more popular and became a television show, but then it also spawned comics as well, which Jack Webb helped on as well. There's many crime shows throughout the early 20th century, and just some of them that were more popular were shows like New York Confidential, Secret Agent, aka Danger Man. It Takes a Thief, the FBI, Perry Mason, which I think my grandma watched all the time, fun fact, and then the Untouchables. Radio and television crime programs from the early 20th century had a big influence on crime comics. Dick Tracy, we had mentioned before, started as a comic strip and then became the radio show, but then, which I also think it became a movie as well, but that's neither here nor there. But then it actually became a comic book as well, comic book series, as we see listed here. And then also, there was other crime books that have tons of crime books that have come. How they influenced was especially in the look of the criminals or the detectives in the crime stories, how they would look on television. They would with the hats and stuff that we would see them wear and the trench coats. That influence stayed in and stayed into the comics as well. Another thing that they did was the real stories and being based off of that were put more into the crime comics and becoming more realistic and gruesome. Another thing that they did was crimes that women would do as well. Um, there wasn't a whole lot of comics originally that it was just men doing comics, but then once radio programs and then television crime programs would include women committing crimes as well, those stories ended up becoming into comics, which like then we see that being put into superhero comics and criminals as well, like Catwoman and stuff like that. And I do have Batman on here, Detective Comics, probably the most well-known, one of the most well-known comic book characters. And I wanted to just mention Detective Comics, or Batman specifically, because he was very influenced by Dick Tracy and Sherlock Holmes. And those crime comics did influence the depiction of Batman from Bob Kane and Bill Finger. So I just wanted to make sure I mentioned those as well. So as I stated, here was my presentation on early 20th century crime radio and television and how it influenced crime comics. It's my works cited page. Thank you so much.